And so Daniel serves as a wise man in the Babylonian royal court. I want you to think about this. Daniel has choices. You are captured and you're brought to a foreign country. Right? There's really no escape because it's hundreds of miles on foot to get back. Where would you go back to anyway? Because you just left a devastated city. So he's stuck there. And now he can either do as he's told, or he can probably not so much plan an escape, but maybe use his position in a palace to try and take the throne from King Nebuchadnezzar. Maybe he can, slip some poison in his soup. Maybe he'll get close enough to put a knife in his back. Maybe he can make friends with the other Jews, the other Israelites there in Babylon. They can rise up. And so they've got these choices that he can make. What's he going to do? How is he going to use his position in the palace in Babylon? Is he going to be longing for Jerusalem and pining for home? Thinking about family members that these people that he's working for killed. Thinking of neighbors that didn't get to make the trip. Where's Daniel going to spend his thoughts? Now, it's true that Daniel and his friends, they seek concessions for their Jewish faith. And so in the first chapter of the book of Daniel, we see how they say, look, we don't want to eat your fancy food. We want to eat our Jewish food that we're familiar with and that pleases God within our dietary restrictions that God's given us, and it works out well for them. But despite seeking that concession, they show no real inclination to protest what happened to them. They're not marching outside the palace, with placards and signs saying Jews belong in Jerusalem. Return us, or better conditions for Jewish workers. They just slip in and they find their place in that system. I wonder how you would feel in this situation if some of your family made it to Toronto. Toronto's come and invaded Rochester. You're taken away. Many people aren't. Many people don't make it. And you're living over there. How are you going to settle in to life there? Pretend that the atrocities never happened? Work for the success of the Toronto hierarchy? Or are you going to look for a way to get help? To get back home? It's a tough situation. But Daniel works for the welfare of the Babylonian Empire. He enters the civil service. We see here just what it says. They entered the king's service. This was their choices, but they go through the trial. They put in their energy and their effort to excel in their trial and to prove themselves for the king, and they are chosen to enter the king's service, the civil service there in Babylon. I wonder, as he did so, if he felt any guilt. If he felt, why am I doing this and getting these opportunities and this fine life in the palace, while others are living in the ruins of Jerusalem, while others are down in a worker settlement by the river. How did he think about those things? We're not told. Now, empires eventually come and go. And the Babylonians go. Right? They are, in time, overwhelmed by the Median Empire, and the Medes and the Persians. And so we have a map here, just so you can see this, that the green is the Babylonian Empire at its peak. The purple is the Median Empire. And you can see it's a big empire in its own right. Persia would be down in the bottom right-hand corner. And so it was sort of part of that Median Empire. So that's why they're called the Medes and the Persians. And so Babylon is certainly a great empire, but there are other significant kingdoms on their doorstep. It's not like they could ever relax. And so while Daniel is in Babylon, the Medes finally break through and capture the city of Babylon. And so in Daniel chapter 6, where we started our reading this morning, we're told it pleased Darius. Darius was one of the, was a Median king. We had Nebuchadnezzar at the beginning of the book, and I think Belshazzar in the middle, and then we have Darius, and a little later we'll have Cyrus. But Darius is the Median king who has taken over. And we see that as he sets up his kingdom, he has to come in, and we've got a whole new bureaucracy. Change of power. New broom comes into Babylon. I don't know if they literally cleaned out the swamp in those days, but that's sort of what's going on here. Right? And so Daniel, though, gets to stay there. He's chosen to remain as one of the administrators. In fact, you can see Daniel distinguished himself among the administrators. There were 3 administrators. Below the 3 administrators of this empire were the satraps, and there were 120 of those, I think it said. So they've got 40 of these satraps reporting to each of the administrators, if it's divided equally. And Daniel is one of those 3 administrators appointed by the new king, Darius. Daniel, though, has enemies. Even though Daniel has been part of the royal court in the city of Babylon for many years, remember who he is? He's a prisoner. He's a refugee. He's an outsider. He's in exile. He's living in a foreign country. He probably talks with a bit of an accent. He doesn't have stories about playing for the local Babylonian football team growing up. He's not one of them. And so when Darius says, you're one of my top 3 government officials, there's pushback from others. You can picture that, can't you? Some of us have relocated to different parts of the country. Some of us come from different cultural backgrounds, and we know that there's an inside and an outside group in any workplace, in any administration. That it's not just the bureaucratic chain of command that decides things. It's the relationships and who you know and what you have in common. Now, Daniel was not just those things of being an outsider, he was also a different religion from everyone else. I don't know what it looked like, but he probably didn't celebrate all of the Babylonian festivals. He didn't throw the biggest parties on those of days for the Babylonian gods. And so his faith made him an outsider there as well. And so his rivals are not happy when he reaches this position of authority. And so they use the system to paint him into a corner. You see, they're cunning. They don't just come out and say, hey, I don't like you, Daniel. They may have said that, but that's not the only thing they did. They may have said, Daniel, you shouldn't be here. They said, no, let's see if we can find some corruption And we'll bring him to trial. And we'll kick him out. Well, that didn't work. They couldn't find anything. And then the next thing they do is say, well, we've got to invent corruption. And they do this in a very cunning way. You see, they know the system. They've been in the institution. They know how government and the legal system works. And so they convince the king to make a new law. They find something good that Daniel does, pray to his God. And then they conspire to make that illegal. The good thing that Daniel does is now illegal. Daniel, what are you going to do? And what's really interesting here is that the king has no idea what's going on. Right? The king signs this law. To him, it's just a law. It makes sense. This is how the kingdom is going to work from now on. But it becomes an assassination. It gets used. It gets weaponized against Daniel. And they paint him into a corner. You see, it's not that the system itself was necessarily corrupt, but it was certainly used in a corrupt way, wasn't it? To target Daniel. The king who ran the system, it didn't mean that he was a bad person in this circumstance. It just meant he'd been manipulated. And so systems can be corrupt, they can be effective, they can be anything in between, but they can be designed. It's not, sometimes it just happens. From the king's point of view, it just happened. From the enemies of Daniel's point of view, they planned it. The system had a purpose. So having been told not to pray, Daniel defies the king. He immediately returns home and prays. I wonder about that prayer. What do you pray when praying has just been made illegal? Now, Daniel prayed 3 times a day facing Jerusalem, where the temple was, where God dwelled. And so they were likely ritual prayers. He had specific prayers at each point in the day. Maybe psalms that he read. But on this occasion, I wonder what Daniel prayed as he knew that he was breaking the law. Probably as he knew he was being observed and watched. Do you pray for your enemies? Do you pray for protection? Do you pray for God to do something, do anything? Or do you just praise God because he's God and Daniel's not? There's a lot of options. How would you pray? Knowing that laws had just been put in place to make you illegal. It's not always a hypothetical question for us. And so his enemies catch him in the act of praying, and they use the system against him and insist that the king punish him. This is how they punish him. That lion looks hungry, doesn't he? You see, when they threw Daniel to the lions, it wasn't the pussycat kind of lions that you see in the zoo, that are well-fed, that are cared for, that are healthy. It's the hungry lions that have been goaded, that have been mistreated, that are angry. In fact, if you jump ahead, you get a good sense of this, because later on, I hate to give the spoiler, but Daniel's enemies are going to be fed to these same lions. And we're told that before they reached the floor of the den, the lions overpowered them and crushed all their bones. They were not different lions from when Daniel was put in the den. They didn't suddenly get an appetite. They didn't suddenly turn mean. This is where Daniel's going. This is where the system is putting him. You see, when we look at Daniel and we look at his efforts at peacemaking, Daniel isn't involved in a one-on-one conflict. We're never told who his rivals are. They don't have names. Gives the impression that it's the other 2 administrators and 120 satraps. That's a system. And it's against Daniel. It's a society. He's on the receiving end of it. It's injustice. There's nothing fair about this. There's nothing right about it. And so Daniel, to this point in his life in Babylon, he has acted as a peacemaker. How has he done that? He's worked for the good of the king of Babylon. He's worked for the good of the people, of the nation of Babylon. He's done his job well, so well that when people go looking for mistakes, looking for corruption, they can't find any. And clearly they expected to find some, right? Everybody does it. Everybody does it. And Daniel says, no, I don't. And they can't find it. That must have been so frustrating for his opponents, right? I know it's out there. We just can't find it. When in fact there was nothing to find. And so Daniel has taken his circumstances where the king that captured, that devastated his city, killed loved ones, that dragged him from Jerusalem to Babylon, he now has been working for the well-being of that king. I don't know if that seems right to you. Is he compromising his identity somehow? Is he giving up? Is he turning his back on his own people? I think it would be a hard thing for him to do. But he is living peacefully within the society that he finds himself. Working to make it as good as he possibly can. I'm sure that in the meantime, that there were armies, the Babylonian armies continued to go out, continued to expand, continued to destroy other cities. It wasn't like they stopped with Jerusalem. And Daniel is functioning within that government, at the top of that government. And so what we see is that Daniel isn't taking a lot of action. He's not rising up. There's no insurrection that's taking place here. He's just working for the well-being of those around him. And now as the institution that he's worked so hard for turns its back on him and feeds him to the lions, it's not him versus the king, because the king actually didn't want to do it. It's him versus these nameless, faceless people out there against a corrupt system. And Daniel doesn't take a lot of action even now. Does he kick and scream as he's dragged from his apartment and brought to the king's palace, to the king's throne? Does he argue with the king? I went looking to see what Daniel said to the king when he was accused. He doesn't say anything. There's nothing recorded there. And so he gets thrown into the lions. We know then how God shuts the lions' mouths, because Daniel relied on God. I think that prayer that he offered not before his arrest, that led to his arrest, I believe that was just like, God, I need you. I need you. I can't take on the system by myself. I can't overthrow the law. That's the way it works. I can't, change the king's mind. That's beyond me. He says, I need you if I'm to have any chance of getting out of this. And so Daniel, the peacemaker, gets thrown with the lions. He comes out though, and he speaks only after he has been pulled out of the lion's den, having survived the night. And Daniel says to the king, as the king says, Daniel, are you there? Are you okay? Daniel says, may the king live forever. My God sent his angel, and he shut the mouths of the lions. They have not hurt me, because I was found innocent in his sight. Right? Notice there's sort of like this little twist there. I was found guilty in your sight. Right? I was in here because I was accused and found guilty of breaking the law, but I was found innocent in the sight of God. Nor have I ever done any wrong before you. Now, that's not true, is it? Because Daniel had done wrong. He had prayed when the king told him not to. And so sometimes the government makes laws. Sometimes we're pressured into doing things. We're painted into corners where we have no choices, where we have to do the right thing, where doing the right thing isn't approved, doesn't meet a culture, doesn't meet an expectation. And Daniel here is able to say, I did the right thing. And even though you have this dopey law, I have never done any wrong before you. Right? It was your law that was wrong, not what I did that was wrong. What I did didn't harm you. I've been working for your good, your majesty. And so what we see then, from a Babylonian perspective, is we see a reform movement within the royal court. It took God to change the system, because it was the system needed to be changed. The wrong people were in the wrong places, and God says, I got a place for you. Right? It's over here with these big kitty cats. Right? And so those people that have corrupted the system, there's a swept out of power and placed, well, they're gone. And new leaders are brought in their place. Because sometimes systems need to be reformed. And as a consequence of that, Daniel was given additional authority. It's interesting, and I'm not going to do this now, but you may want to think about it, to compare Daniel's approach with that of Esther and Mordecai. Very similar stories as to how that plays out as they work within a corrupt political system that's seeking to harm them. I want to give you two examples of Jesus as he interacts with corrupt systems. Okay? And before I get into that, I will just say, I'm aware we had an election this week. Okay? And I'm really not commenting on one side or another of that, but just in general terms, right? So don't try and say, oh, Peter was talking about this party or that party. What I'm saying is that sometimes the systems, whatever they are and whoever's running them, aren't what they should be. The people, whoever they are, aren't who they should be. And how do God's people interact with that? How do we be peacemakers in a situation where we see things not being what they should? One of the experts in the law spoke to Jesus, who'd been teaching and saying nasty things to them. He said, "Teacher, when you say these things, you insult us also. Us, the teachers, the experts in the law. You're insulting us." Jesus replied, "And you, experts in the law, woe to you, because you load people down with burdens they can hardly carry, and you yourselves will not lift one finger to help them." Okay. He's talking here to religious leaders. Maybe you can think of other leaders that this would be appropriate for. They're saying, okay, you need to work harder. You need to do more. You need to perform better. But we're not going to give you the equipment, the resources you need. We're not going to get down there with you to help you. That's your job. You figure it out. It's Pharaoh with the Israelites, right? Where they're making bricks for the building the city, and he says, okay, now I'm going to take away the straw that you use in the bricks. But I want your production to increase. Right. He says, no, I'm not going to help you. I'll actually make it harder for you. But then you figure it out. You're the ones making the bricks. You get it done. And so these religious leaders are doing that for these people. And so we need to be careful that we're not laying burdens on people and saying, look, you need to live this kind of life. You can't do that. You should do this. Without also coming alongside people and caring for them. You see, that's what so many institutions, including churches, can be criticized for doing, is being impersonal, of turning people into numbers. And saying, this is, if you don't meet our standards, if you don't measure up to our metrics, then we've got a problem. But Jesus says, no, you come alongside those people. They're struggling, you help. You help them. You guide them. You advise them. You be there with them. And so, as leaders in the church, or even as Christians, no matter how long you've been here, when we see people who are struggling in their faith, what's our attitude? How do we respond to that? Do we step back and say, you've got problems? Or we step forward and say, let's talk about your problems. And so this is Jesus pushing back against the religious institution of his day. He did that a lot because ultimately that's injustice, isn't it? Demanding something of people that they can't do on their own and then failing to help them. And then the second story we have here is a familiar one for many of us, and it's the story of the widow's mite. Let me just read this. As Jesus looked up, he saw the rich putting their gifts into the temple treasury. He's sitting there in the temple courtyard. He also saw a poor widow put in 2 very small copper coins. Truly, I tell you, he said, this poor widow has put in more than all the others. All these people gave their gifts out of their wealth, but she, out of her poverty, put in all that she had to live on. Now, I've often heard this used as an example we should follow. But I want to just propose another way of viewing this. You can decide which one you prefer. Because there is a way of viewing this where Jesus is being critical of the temple authorities. Because there are people who are coming in and they give 100 coins. But they've got 1,000,000 coins back at their house. And they drop them in and everybody knows, oh, look, there's 100. Okay? Listen to that. Musical money just dropping in the box. Okay? And so, but it's really nothing. It's 0.5%, or it's a 1.01% of their wealth. But something about the temple authorities, the expectations of people, says that this woman should take her last 2 coins. And not just a woman, a widow. What do we know about widows in Jewish society? What's the social security system available to them? Right? And so this widow, who was already living in poverty, already has a very limited support network, is somehow expected to take her last 2 coins and give them to God. Now, I can respect her heart to doing what she believes is right. But there is something about a system, something about an institution, something about the leaders of that temple that says to all the widows out there, we want 100% of what you have. I don't know where your next meal's coming from, but you better put your coins in that box. While they put in 0.01 of their wealth. And they go home and they have their servants kill whatever animal they fancy that day. Their chef cooks up something in the kitchen that they can enjoy. And I wonder if they even think about that woman again. That's a cruel system, isn't it? It's a cruel system. We've had different fundraising campaigns here at Lawson Road. Churches do that. But I don't think we've ever asked anyone to go homeless so that we can have a church building. Right? To go hungry so that we can have a fellowship hall. Yes, you'd be giving to God, not to us. Right? We can manipulate systems, good systems, to accomplish our goals, to hurt other people. I think that Jesus here is criticizing that attitude, that behavior, that expectation of the widow. Remember, this is the same time period where he's going to go through the temple and kick out those people that are using the temple to make money. Right? There's a bit of a theme that's running here as we read through this passage. You see, Jesus is a little bit like Daniel. He knows that there's corruption. In his case, it's not with the Roman government. He leaves the Romans alone. But he's concerned about the system that is the religious institution. And he doesn't really engage it a whole lot. But when he does, he speaks out against it. He tells them what they're doing wrong. He points out the problems and the injustice and the hypocrisy that takes place within that regime, within that leadership of that system. The temple was given by God. There's nothing wrong with the temple. Giving a sacrifice, telling people what expectations God has for them. There's nothing wrong with it. It's all good things from God. But we can ruin the very best of things. That's why we need shalom, isn't it? To put things back together, to put things back the way they should be. And so Jesus, even though he's creating conflict, even though he's hurting feelings, is actually creating peace as he seeks to restore and reform the system in a way that it makes life better for the people that participate in it. But Jesus doesn't destroy the temple. Not here, right? Jesus reforms it. He takes out the money changers. He points out and highlights the injustice. And he works and he loves and he cares for the people that he can contact. So I want to just leave you with this thought. When we think about peacemaking, I think we look at Daniel's life and we can think, oh, the way to make peace when we live within a society that makes life difficult for us, where laws aren't fair, where leaders take advantage of their position, whatever it might be, however we want to frame that, we can say, well, Daniel just worked within it, ignored all the corruption, swept it under the rug. We could also say the same for Jesus, right? Jesus never demanded that the high priest resign because he'd bought the position rather than following the proper from the Roman government, rather than following the proper God-given rules for how to appoint a high priest. He didn't do that. We could say, oh, look, Jesus just worked within the system, didn't shake the boat. But Jesus did point it out. Daniel did lead a reform movement, in a sense. There comes a point to say, I'm not going to participate any further. I'm going to highlight what's wrong. I'm going to be true to who I am. I'm going to be true to who God wants me to be. And I'm going to say what God expects, not only of me, but of those around me and of those he puts in positions of authority. And so what I take from this is that peacemaking means picking our battles, right? Not ignoring injustice. You see, you and I, or Lawson Road as a church, we cannot change everything. If all of us march to Washington, D.C., or to the United Nations, or to wherever it is that we want to march, we probably wouldn't accomplish anything. But there are opportunities around us to put a spotlight on injustice, on people who are hurting, highlighting where things are not the way they should be. We pick our battles. We speak up for those who have no voice. We represent Jesus to the world. It requires wisdom, because it's easy to jump up every time we see something not the way it should be. But it requires wisdom to say, am I the person? Is this the time? Is this the place for me, for us, to speak up? And in doing that, we continue to love and care for each other along the way. We can't lose sight of that. You can't become so enamored by the campaign, so enamored by the cause, that we forget to care for the individuals, the people that are hurting. Sometimes it'll be us. Sometimes it'll be those around us. It's not always about government either, is it? It can be workplaces. It can be plenty of other, it can be churches. It can be plenty of other places where silence can create problems. And we need to find our voice. May God give us wisdom as we seek to be peacemakers, using our voice for Him at the appropriate time.